Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. Hugs to everybody, and I hope you're doing marvellously well. I'm doing it great, thank you very much, and love to all of you. And I hope you're going to go and get something lovely to drink, because I've got a lovely story for you this evening. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with this story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Mrs. Nina Montgomery followed my mother into the kitchen. She had grown exceedingly close to my mother over the years, as the Montgomerys lived next door to us, their house separated from ours by a small scattering of trees, which made a very tiny sized grove, I suppose, a dividing line, you could say, between our two properties. Mrs. Montgomery's children were adults. They were in their 20s and had long since left home. Mrs. Montgomery had said they really needed to broaden their horizons and stretch their wings so that they could soar into the sky. It would seem living in Appalachia could not offer her adult children the opportunities they were eager to embrace. And had her children been of average intelligence, they probably would have remained in Appalachia for the foreseeable future, as back in those days, opportunities like those the Montgomery kids had acquired were few and far between. It was only if you were exceptionally gifted and talented that you would be noticed by mainstream society, especially if you lived in a hollow like we did. It would seem that Mrs. Montgomery's children were so incredibly bright that they had both received scholarships after having won first prizes in science competitions in New York, where only the most talented of children would actually enter such competitions, which meant, to two unlikely kids from a little hollow like ours, being discovered like this was like finding two diamonds in the rough, despite the fact that the Montgomery children came from humble backgrounds much like myself. I knew Mrs. Montgomery missed her grown-up children desperately. They were now living in Boston and doing exceptionally well for themselves in their careers. They'd regularly send money home to their parents, so the Montgomery standard of living had improved in leaps and bounds, as back in those days in Appalachia, not many of us were fortunately blessed with deep pockets. Indeed, some people could be described as being dirt poor. My father was a coal miner at the time, and he didn't exactly earn a whole lot of dough, but as children we wanted for nothing, and considered ourselves to live extremely blessed lives. And looking back, I believe we were extremely privileged, as one thing I learnt from growing up without much money was that relationships with both family and friends are so much more important than material gain of any kind. When Mrs. Montgomery would tell us about her adult children living in Boston and the privileges they were enjoying in this cosmopolitan metropolis, as a rather naive young 10-year-old boy at the time, who was not exactly well versed in things that happened beyond my simple home in Appalachia, it certainly seemed for me and my sister Bethany, the life Mrs. Montgomery was telling us about, that her adult children appeared to be enjoying, seemed an entire world away from us, almost as if Boston was another planet that was under the control of an intelligent race of beings who were light years ahead of us, while our little humble home in Appalachia was almost primitive by contrast. And the truth was, it most certainly was. Never for a moment did I look at our shabby home, with the threadbare curtains in the kitchen and some newspapers pressed against the walls to improve the insulation for the winter months when the weather became icy cold. Did I ever for even a second think I was living a life of what some might describe as less? For in my opinion, my life was richly abundant. And the truth was, I didn't know any better. The Montgomerys were both approaching their 60s now, and they continued to live next door to us. Me and my sister Bethany were sitting at the far end of the kitchen table on this very overcast, gloomy morning, trying in earnest to put the pieces of a rather complicated jigsaw puzzle together. Mrs. Montgomery's daughter, Kirsty, had sent us the puzzle as a gift. My family had always adored jigsaw puzzles, and when the weather was bad like this, rather than playing outdoors, we would put a puzzle together on the kitchen table. The year was 1971. I was 10 years old at the time, going on 11, and Bethany was 9. I noticed that the forlorn slate-grey sky had become incredibly overcast. It looked miserable, like it might possibly rain, and the distant grumbles of thunder made the potential of rain even more likely. But to tell you the truth, I enjoyed being tucked away cosily in our little home, while listening to the rain as it pelted down onto our roof. It wasn't raining yet, but I could taste the rain in the air, and knew it was coming. For my senses back in the day were highly tuned to the environment, as much of my time was spent playing out of doors with my sister Bethany. "Good Lord," said Mrs. Montgomery, as she entered our kitchen breezily, shaking her long, slender body like a dog that's just climbed out of the water after a good swim. "The weather out there looks utterly miserable, does it not? It's grown all dark all of a sudden. It's definitely going to storm. I predict rain and plenty of it. Not that I'm complaining, of course. We could certainly do with some rain." Mrs. Montgomery's kind dark eyes focused on me and my sister Bethany. "How are the two of you enjoying the puzzle?" she asked me. "I know it's a tough one, but in my book, that makes it all the more exciting. You wouldn't want a puzzle too easy, would you, Randall?" She directed the question at me. "The harder the better," I said. "I like the fact that it's not easy, Mrs. Montgomery. I think simple puzzles are boring." "Well, Kirsty thought you kids would like it. She said it was certainly a challenging puzzle. And when Kirsty was your age, she loved puzzles like you do. But then again, she was always bright as a button, loved her mind being stimulated. I can see you children are just like her. You never know. One of these days you might win a science prize yourselves and end up in Boston like my adult kids. The world can be full of exciting surprises, you know." I shook my head sorrowfully. "I don't think so, Mrs. Montgomery. Everyone knows your kids were exceptionally clever. That's why they won the science prizes in New York and got all those scholarships. I'm not sure that will happen to me and Bethany. I think we're both of average intelligence." "Goodness gracious, young man," said Mrs. Montgomery in a scolding voice. "Listen to yourself. Don't you dare sell yourself short. You sound as if you've got a defeatist mentality and are resigned to the status quo, which is not going to do you any favours in the long term. I know it's extremely difficult to get noticed by the outside world when we all live in a dusty hollow like this. But nothing is impossible, and you need to recognise that. The thing you need to do is dream big. That's what my adult children did, and look where they are today. They didn't hold back on their ambitions. We create our own realities, but doubting our ability to succeed is pretty much like putting a curse on ourselves. So don't you dare do that to yourself, young man. I know it's harder for those of us that do not have financial resources at our disposal, or the opportunities most affluent kids have. So yes, we do have to work twice as hard as they do. But if you stand out from the crowd, you will be noticed, and that's what you both need to do." Mrs. Montgomery may have lived in Appalachia, but she hadn't grown up here, so she was extremely different to the other locals in the community. And there were times she stuck out like a sore thumb, but not in a bad way, of course. Mrs. Montgomery was well loved and accepted by everyone. My mother particularly warmed to her, describing her as like a breath of fresh air. I think Mrs. Montgomery was from somewhere in the West Coast, but I never found out exactly where. And back in those days, I didn't even inquire about such things. I don't even know how she'd met her husband, Russell Montgomery, for the two of them were from completely different walks of life. So how their paths crossed, I'm not entirely sure, although my mother believes that Mr. Montgomery, on a trip to the West Coast, encountered Mrs. Montgomery on the beach, and the two of them got talking, and the rest is history, of course. Whether that's a true story I cannot tell you for sure. I do know Mrs. Montgomery was estranged from both her parents, for they told her she had married beneath her station, and therefore they wanted nothing more to do with her. In those days, whether people wanted to admit it or not, there was certainly inverted snobbery among certain social circles, and there probably still is today, although no one is willing to admit it. especially when America is considered the land of great opportunity. But I'm not sure it really is for everyone. I know that Mrs. Montgomery was cut off from her parents' will, and she never spoke to them again. Certainly after she married Russell, all ties with them were severed. The Montgomery wedding, I am told, was a quiet affair, where not one member of Mrs. Montgomery's side of the family was in attendance, which shows that her infuriatingly snooty parents really had chosen to snub her. She told my mother that her father had said to her, "If you dare marry that piece of riffraff from Appalachia, that coal miner, you're no longer my daughter." And by the sounds of things, he really did cut ties with Mrs. Montgomery for good, for she never ever heard from her parents again. They never even sent her a Christmas card at Christmas time, nor did they inquire after their grandchildren, although I doubt they even knew they had any. When Mrs. Montgomery's father passed away, she had reached out to him on hearing about his ailing condition, but was never able to say her goodbyes to him, for even on his deathbed, he wanted nothing more to do with her, which I think was awfully sad. My father would say that some people that come from wealthier backgrounds couldn't accept it when one of their children married someone from a less fortunate background. So I can't imagine it was easy for poor Mrs. Montgomery to leave behind a more privileged, cushy way of life that she'd enjoyed as a girl, and move away to live in the simplicity of Appalachia, where she knew money would always be tight, and her life a relentless financial struggle. But many, like Mrs. Montgomery, have given up much for love. You hear of people like this all the time, like American girls marrying into an African tribe and living a very humble lifestyle in Africa. But the love they have for their partner cements their unlikely, very unorthodox marriage, which I believe is what happened to the Montgomerys. They may have been an extremely unlikely couple to come together, but their marriage was enviably rock solid. The couple loved the bones of each other, and everybody could see that. Many wondered what a live wire like Mrs. Montgomery could see in her rather dull husband Russell, who hardly set the world on fire. These days, with Mrs. Montgomery's now grown-up kids making such a success of their lives in Boston and sending money home to their parents upon their insistence, things for the Montgomerys were much more rosy in the garden. They'd fixed up their ramshackle home and transformed it into a beautiful-looking house that was the envy of most of the locals living in our hollow, because the Montgomerys' house looked incredible, and was described by many as the rose among the thorns, because quite simply it was the only decent house in the hollow, when all the other houses were rather shabby, much like ours. Mrs. Montgomery's husband worked as a carpenter doing odd jobs for people, but prior to that he'd also been a coal miner, much like my father. Ironically, Russell Montgomery never socialized with my father or anyone else for that matter. He was one of those reticent, underwhelming characters that seemed to take refuge from any uncomfortable social interactions with people by hiding in the shadows like a shy, retiring child, and he kept himself very much to himself, and even among the locals in our immediate community, none of them knew him very well. My mother always wondered how the Montgomerys had ever come together, as Nina Montgomery was gregarious and charming, while her husband was just so quiet and would barely say boo to a goose. But my father would always say that maybe Mrs. Montgomery was attracted to quiet men. She enjoyed the challenge of getting to know someone who probably hid his true colours from the rest of the world, and that there was a side to Mr. Montgomery that nobody else would ever get to see. "Some women find the shy types of men desperately attractive," he would say. When my mother invited the Montgomerys over for a meal, which she did on occasion, even when we didn't really have a brass farthing to rub together at times, so some of the meals my mother cooked were cheap, simplistic, filling, somewhat stodgy, but always delicious without exception. Mr. Montgomery would sit at the table next to his wife Nina, barely uttering a single word, while Nina Montgomery would entertain everyone with her funny, sharp, witty stories, which would have everyone around the dinner table cracking a smile, as Mrs. Montgomery knew how to make people laugh, and she did it as naturally as breathing. Maybe that was one of the quintessential reasons when she moved into our cliquey hollow that she was accepted so warmly by the local community here, for she broke down the barriers of reserve with an effortless ease, almost as if she was waving a magic wand. The locals unabashedly welcomed her into the hollow, as if she'd always belonged. I rather suspect that Nina Montgomery would be able to live anywhere she wanted in the world without exception, and be easily accepted by the local community there. She was adaptable like that, rather like a chameleon that could turn pink on a pink rosebush or yellow on some dry grass. She knew how to adapt with effortless ease to her surroundings. She'd have probably been comfortable eating in a king's palace, at a grand table, or enjoying a humble sandwich on the side of the road with a homeless man. Mrs. Montgomery dressed differently to the other people in Appalachia where we lived in a hollow. And if you don't know what a hollow is, it's a local community, situated in a valley, where there's usually a creek running through it, endless woodgroves of trees and sometimes mountain views. In Appalachia there are many people living in hollows, and some of these communities of people can be quite cliquey and rather unfriendly towards strangers. My sister Bethany would say that in the Montgomery household, Mrs. Montgomery was like a splendid male peacock, while her husband was like a dull-looking female peacock, whose plumage is so unexceptional and grey, so you barely ever even noticed him, as dare I say, he was pretty ordinary, always wearing plaid shirts and overalls, and never troubling himself very much with his appearance. Mrs. Montgomery, on the other hand, was the antithesis of her husband Russell, for she always looked as if she'd stepped out of a bandbox. Before the Montgomerys had been blessed with extra money from their adult kids, Mrs. Montgomery had owned 3 dresses in her wardrobe that most people would have worn for church on Sunday, but back then she wore those dresses every day of the week, alternating between them, and then she had another very special dress that was reserved only for Sunday church services. Nowadays things had changed, as Mrs. Montgomery seemed to be wearing a different elegant dress every single day of the week, complemented with plenty of colourful beads or interesting costume jewellery that she wore around her neck. She looked so lovely. I noticed that even when Nina Montgomery would take exercise, she'd always wear one of her dresses, which seemed really rather impractical. But she didn't care about that. She was the kind of unusual woman who liked to look good at all times, even when she was tending to her vegetable patch, feeding the chickens or hanging the washing out on the line. My mother told me once that when Mrs. Montgomery's own mother was pregnant with her, she'd always wanted to have a boy, and when she believed she was carrying a girl from an instinct that she couldn't shake off, she'd been so disappointed that she'd cried every day throughout her pregnancy. When Nina was born, she had spent her youth trying to please her mother by being a tomboy, because she wanted her mother to love her more and forget that she was a girl. But she claimed she had never really succeeded in that endeavour. She'd cut her hair short and wear jeans and T-shirts all the time, hoping that her mother would see her in a new light, but it never happened. One day she decided enough was enough, and that she would get in touch with the feminine side of her personality, and from that day forward she never ever wore a pair of jeans again. It was almost as if she was rebelling against her own mother, and saying, "I'm a girl, get over it. I can't be what you want me to be, and I'm not going to bother trying any more." She told my mother once that she didn't even own a pair of shorts or pants. She didn't want to feel like a boy. It was like all those years she had tried to be a boy to appease her mother had come back to haunt her. So she shied away from wearing anything that a man might choose to wear. I know many of the local men in our community would give Mrs. Montgomery approving looks, and sometimes even a toothless grin, as alas many people in Appalachia during the 1970s had pretty bad dental care, and especially in the hollow, for a lot of elderly folk had lost many teeth, and some were wearing dentures that barely fit, that made them look as if Dracula was walking around us during the daylight hours. I think the men liked Mrs. Montgomery because she took great care of herself, and was so incredibly feminine, and in a hard environment such as Appalachia, where life can be incredibly tough at the best of times, femininity is a very attractive quality to men. It's rather like discovering a single flower growing in a field of dry grass. That beautiful flower is going to stand out any way you look at it and be highly esteemed and revered. And Mrs. Montgomery was for many men that beautiful flower. Since Mrs. Montgomery's children had moved to Boston, they were sending her money regularly, so her wardrobe had increased in leaps and bounds. She had designer purses, gorgeous cashmere sweaters, fabulously elegant shoes, and a vast selection of very pretty dresses, now added to her ever-increasing wardrobe. Almost as if overnight she had become a celebrity of note. I could see, even though my mother tried desperately to hide it, she was a tad envious of her friend's expansive collection of beautiful clothes that had not come cheap. But I'm sure Mrs. Montgomery was the envy of most of the women in the Hollow. It was weird to have someone living in our very unglamorous community, looking as if they belonged on the red carpet in Hollywood, rather than among the hilly valleys of this uncompromising landscape. When Mrs. Montgomery arrived at our tumble-down house to enjoy a cup of tea with my mother, which she did on a regular basis as a matter of routine, to catch up on news and to enjoy some light-hearted conversation, she seemed to be full of the joys of spring that morning, for there was a lightness to her step and an undeniable swing to her hips. Ostensibly, over the years, Nina Montgomery and my mother had become firm, very close friends, even though there was a significant 20-year age gap between the two of them. At almost 60 years old, Nina Montgomery looked like a movie star, despite the fact that in those days cosmetic procedures that are enjoyed by the Hollywood elite today did not exactly exist back then in the 1970s, so you pretty much had to make the most of what nature had endowed you with, as there were no Botox injections to suppress the frown lines between the eyebrows, or fillers to fill out the wrinkles on the sides of the mouth. My mother would say that Nina Montgomery had oodles of style that now was complemented by her amazing wardrobe. And despite the fact that we lived in a rural part of the world, where people here didn't really trouble themselves too much about what they looked like, Nina Montgomery appeared to go all out to look like $1 million, when only the trees and the flowers in the field, as well as the local community, could fully appreciate her monumental efforts to look so beautiful. My loving father had looked at my mother rather tenderly, with a sorrowful expression on his face, and said, "I really do wish I had the money to buy you such fine clothes, like Nina Montgomery is wearing these days. It seems like those adult children of hers have upgraded her life significantly of late. Certainly they have since they moved to Boston. My guess is they're sending her a great deal of money. I mean, look at how Nina has transformed that house of theirs, when before their home was much like ours. It seems idiosyncratic to have such a nice-looking house in the Hollow, where shabbiness around here is the order of the day. My guess is that if you could dress like Nina Montgomery, my love, you would unquestionably be the finest-looking woman in these parts, without question." "You mean I'm not already the finest-looking woman in Appalachia?" my mother would tease, giving my father a mischievous wink, for my mother loved pulling my father's chain. "I never said that, love. Don't put words in my mouth," my father had said, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "You are the finest-looking woman in these parts for sure. There is no doubt about that in my mind. But I'm only saying that if you had Mrs. Montgomery's new, very glamorous wardrobe, you would be the showstopper in the garden, would you not? You would be the flower that would blow all the others out of the water without question. The rose that outshines all the others by its sheer magnificence and splendor." "Honestly, Ralph, you're hilariously funny," my mother would say. "You're quite the smooth talker, are you not? I'm only teasing you. Granted, I wouldn't mind a wardrobe like Nina Montgomery. I mean, who wouldn't? My bet is she's the envy of every single woman in Appalachia. But I will tell you something, Rolf. I'm very happy with my lot, thank you very much. I don't need a whole lot in my life. If I've got you and the children, and I have a dress to wear to church on Sundays that is relatively decent to look at, I'm a happy woman indeed. What else could I want?" "What did I do to deserve you, Harriet?" my father would say. "You're so undemanding. I couldn't have asked for a lovelier and more magnificent wife than you. I must have done something right, for the good Lord to have blessed me with a wife such as yourself. For the Bible certainly tells us in Proverbs 27 that a quarrelling wife is as bothersome as the continual dripping on a rainy day, and stopping her is like stopping the wind or trying to grab oil by the hands. In other words, impossible. And there are many men who have wives like that. I'm just eternally grateful that I'm not one of them." Oh, Rolf, the compliments are really rolling off your tongue today, are they not? Keep them coming, my mother chuckled. Would you like some tea? My mother asked Nina Montgomery, whose attention was devotedly fixed on the complicated puzzle that me and my sister Bethany were trying our best to masterfully put together. Nina picked up a loose piece of the puzzle and slid it into a space for me, and I looked up at her with a grin. Thanks, Mrs. Montgomery. I was struggling to find where that piece actually fit, and you found it for me. Glad to be of help, Randall, said Mrs. Montgomery, giving me a mischievous wink. I'm pretty nifty with puzzles myself, she said. She looked up at my mother, who was watching us with a quizzical look on her face, and said, What are you staring at? Honestly, Harriet, aren't you going to put the kettle on? It's not going to boil itself. I'm parched, so I'm really looking forward to a very strong cup of tea. Coming up, Your Highness, said my mother, making a mock, rather cheeky salute at Nina. Nina chuckled and walked over to the far end of the kitchen table, opposite from where me and my sister Bethany were seated, as I'm afraid to say our puzzle had unapologetically taken up half the kitchen table. Nina gently pulled out a chair and sat down with such a grace that she almost looked like a ballerina. Her hands were knitted together in a prayer-like posture, as if for a moment she was deep in thought. My mother put the kettle on the hob. It wasn't long before the kettle was boiling away merrily. I could hear the clink of teacups and saucers as my mother prepared a tea tray to bring to the table, with a teapot, a jug of milk, a bowl of sugar, and 2 glasses of icy lemonade for me and my sister Bethany to enjoy. My mother used to make the best lemonade I've ever tasted, and even when I try to nostalgically recreate her recipe today, it is usually with little success, for I never come close to making it like she did. Back in those days, even if you lived in a hollow in Appalachia, you didn't just throw a tea bag into a mug, as they do so haphazardly today, with so little care. Tea, much like it is for the Japanese today, was a loving ritual for my family, where the best china was always brought out in a ceremonial way. I still remember what Mrs. Montgomery was wearing that day. The dress she wore was one of the most beautiful I'd ever seen her in. The long dress came up to her ankles. It was belted around her very small waist. It was an emerald green colour, which was the perfect match to a male peacock. I smiled to myself as Bethany had described Mrs. Montgomery as having the plumage of a male peacock, and today she was wearing a dress that embodied that magnificent green colour. I knew Mrs. Montgomery looked good for her age, but my mother told me she dyed her hair blonde with one of those home dye kits you get at the chemist, and she did a great job at dyeing her hair. I always believed she was a natural blonde, when I understand she was really a brunette. Not many people bothered to dye their hair in Appalachia when they got to Mrs. Montgomery's age, nor did they bother to apply a touch of lipstick to their lips like Mrs. Montgomery always did. Even as a 10-year-old boy, I decided when I was older I'd like to marry a girl that was as pretty as Nina Montgomery. My mother handed Mrs. Montgomery a cup of tea. She cradled it in her hands, warming her palms against the mug. She glanced pensively out of the window at the dark sky that hung like a gloomy curtain over the mountains. The howling wind was shaking the trees vigorously, while the booming thunder was increasing in intensity, getting louder by the second. So we were sure we were in for a storm. Good Lord, it's dreadful out there, is it not? The wind is beginning to howl, and it's definitely going to bucket down any minute with rain, said Mrs. Montgomery, shivering in disgust. I noticed this morning that Mrs. Montgomery had a glow to her face that I don't think I'd ever seen before. She looked much more radiant than usual. Maybe it was because she was wearing such a magnificent green colour that it made her feel as good as she looked. But when I observed the undeniable dewy sparkle in her chocolate-brown eyes, I knew she seemed incredibly happy about something, almost as if she'd received the best news ever, like when your numbers for the lottery come up and you realise you've won big. Nina Montgomery was always in a good mood without exception. I never saw her lose her temper once, or even curse. She was a dignified woman like that, but I'd also never seen her look as pleased as she genuinely did on this morning. My mother obviously picked up on Nina's ebullience. Because my mother was a very perceptive woman like that, she smiled fondly at her friend, opening up a tin of cookies, which she brought over to the table. She told Mrs. Montgomery to help herself, and proceeded to pull out a chair on the opposite side of the table, where she routinely could see and observe her friend while they talked together. My mother also cradled her tea in her hands, enjoying the warmth the steam generated. It was definitely fresh out there today, so holding a warm cup of tea was like clutching a hot water bottle, and it was something the older generation always did to keep their hands lovely and warm, and was a habit that I soon learnt when I got older myself. Mrs. Montgomery stared longingly at the oatmeal and raisin cookies in the tin that my mother presented to her, which I knew were her absolute favourite, that she found almost impossible to resist. "I really shouldn't, Harriet," she said. "I'm trying to watch my figure. What are you trying to do to me? I mean, I've got all these lovely dresses to keep fitting into, have I not? And I certainly don't want to become like a whale, because will my husband ever look at me again, I wonder, if I become like that? Oh, you know, Russell, he'd love you if you were dressed in sackcloth and ashes, or looked as prickly as a porcupine, Nina. Personally, I've got a soft spot for whales, so I won't hear anything said against them. They're the most gorgeous creatures of the ocean, as far as I'm concerned," my mother teased. "Go on, Nina, have a cookie, will you? Your figure looks very trim, if you ask me, so I don't think a few extra calories are going to hurt you." Nina's resolve melted like butter being spread across a steaming piece of hot toast. She eagerly dipped her perfectly manicured hand into the tin of cookies and pulled out a cookie, taking a very careful bite, as if she was resolutely determined to savour the flavour and eat the cookie as slowly as possible to make it last for a very long time. I noticed her long fingers were shaking. It wasn't with nerves. I knew that Mrs. Montgomery was excited about something, and for once in my life I was distracted away from the jigsaw puzzle that had held my attention for so long. My sharp eyes eagerly pinned themselves directly on Nina Montgomery. As much like my mother, I was eager to know why she was in exceptionally good mood. I mean, I'd never seen her look like this before. The excitement in the kitchen that morning was as infectious as a virulent flu strain, but this was one that you would definitely want to catch. So there we are, that is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.